Thank you very much, Yves, for a really very interesting talk that sets us up for the symposium very well, but is also truly insightful as a standalone talk. And thank you for staying on time and doing it in English. We do have time for questions, and I will just, okay, you can...
Yeah, that should stay with him, so he can answer the questions.
Okay, I will take the microphone, the walking around, take the talking stick.
Thank you very much for your talk. It's not clear to me whether you are happy or sad that the 1940s and on Republic of Science has changed, so that's one question. You said at one point that you thought, you know, notwithstanding all the different kinds of science you enumerated, there was really only good or bad. But it seems to me, given the very large budgets that are devoted, isn't there also a question of which science? And you know, you seem to cast a little bit of an aspersion on big science, but it seems to me in social science in particular, the absence of big science is a major gap.
Thank you. For the first question, I'm very glad you asked it, because the reason why you could not answer this by yourself is on purpose. My view of this is that I look at science as an ethnography of red ants and black ants. When someone look at the fight between red ants and black ants, most sociologists would say, let's start the association of defense of red ants, because the black ants took some red ants into their own work. So they have slavery exists among ants. You know, it's a fabulous thing. But I think the job of the ethologist is to describe that there is such a thing as slavery and have a theory to explain it. So I'm not against, as a sociologist, I try to understand, I think we live in a new system, so I call it a new social contracts. I try to describe these characteristics, why groups can do things they could not do 20 years ago. So technology plays a role, but not only that, general education level. So I describe the things, and so I have no moral view. And if I gave the impression that I'm against big science, I'm sorry, because I've just described that in the time of X-rays, it was public science. It means that many high school teachers do that. No high school teacher now can check if the Higgs boson exists. Nobody on earth can do it except the CERN. 30 years ago, the American could do it at the SLAC in the States. Now they close it because it costs too much. Okay? So I'm not asperging things on this. I say, you make choice. It's like saying that, but the conservative government is right to insist that the only good science is science for the economy and for... I say, okay, you can believe that, so vote for him. I don't vote for that, I don't believe that, but as a sociologist, I'm not a moralist. I want to describe how things works. And then we can discuss if my model works or not. Pressure group are new, they go in government. For example, I wrote an editorial in Research Money, where I took a stand as a citizen saying that the kind of money the government is giving directly to scientists at the perimeter should make them think. Because if they accept that, and they're very glad to bypass peer review because they are the perimeter, in 2 years, when the government will decide that it does the same thing but for bizarre understanding, you could not stand up and defend peer review because you have yourself accepted that. So I described the mechanism, and then I could give my view. But here, I tried to describe a purely historical, sociological understanding of the transformation, of the rise of private science, and the end of the Republic of Science. And it has consequences now, if I'm right. Scientists have to say, okay, that's why now they come to me and they want to talk. Before they just say, explain to me the universe, okay, I take notes. Like I took the physician as an example because I think it's a good paradigm. You went there, you waited, he took your pressure, and you wait for the diagnostic. Okay, now you say, wait, I check the pressure, you want to give me those pills, I check that those pills gives this secondary effects on the web, what do you think about it? Now he has to explain that. So but I'm not saying it's good or bad, because this, I think, is not the job I'm paid for.
So my question is a little bit exploratory, but as you know, I sort of come from the technology end, and one of the things I see is that a lot of stuff that becomes science actually grows up in this very it grows up in corporations in the process of doing big things in the world. And then because those big things are existing and they've gotten sort of political support and economic support for those big things, the science kind of goes along with it. I don't know if you have any thoughts or ideas about that.
You mean about the relationship between the fact that in the old linear model, we thought that we had pure science. Now we can have new scientific discovery because of purely technical research in industry. We all know it, but we have always to remind that Louis Pasteur was not doing pure research. He was doing contract for industry. So he discovered his microbes because he wanted to understand why the beer is not good, why there's a problem with wine. He was always in practical. So I'm opposed, for example, to the distinction between pure and applied science. I don't believe in theory, as I said, it's not a good category because very often the case of Pasteur was seen as the incarnation of pure research. Pasteur was not doing pure research.
That's not quite what I'm
Okay.
saying. What I'm saying is that the entire system is not in public.
Oh yes, of course. If we mean by that half of the R&D in the States is military, for example, it's all private research, even in the sense that it's not even public. And you know what I discovered last week, and maybe my friend Sergio knew it, but I did not know that. Now, and it's extraordinary in sociological terms, I never thought about this. Now we talk about peer review. As you know, peer review, you have journals. You have public journals where there have been peer review. Now you have secret journal with peer review. In the States, they have discovered that there are secret research by the Navy and the Army, and they said, Wes, we still want to keep that secret, but we want to be sure that it's not garbage sold by some think tank who is an ideologue. So they said, we create a journal. So it's in one of the latest issue of Science. It's a journal with editors. They say, okay, we have peer review, but we don't. The only one who can read the journal are those who get the number from the Army or you have the clearance. If you have the clearance, you can read the journal. So you have peer review in science, but it's a secret science. So there are secret science. But here, I just talk about, because it was science, policy, and society, of course, I talk about the public part. So all the secret part, either of the Army, the Navy, or the companies who don't take patents because they want a secret. Okay, of course, it's not there at all. It's just the part on which we have access. But it's great to think that you can have peer-reviewed journal, which is a secret journal, accessible only to those who have clearance. I never knew about it.
Yes, thanks very much for the presentation. Very interesting. I'd just like to go back to, still works? Yeah. I'd just like to go back to your example of the Perimeter Institute. And I'd like to ask you and make a comparison with research that is conducted intramuros by the government, so which also bypasses the peer review process by the council. So I'd just like to know, where do you draw the difference between, you might say that the providing money directly to the Perimeter Institute would be the government of Canada saying we need to do theoretical physics or farming out the yeah, so I'd just like to know how do you draw the limit between?
Okay, I think
there's an obvious one, but
no, it's not just obvious. I think it must be clear. Of course, we can always have sophistic discourse. Sophism is very important in politics, but a university, okay, is essentially a para-public institution. A government laboratory is not doing research for the same reason as a university. It's essentially doing research for the state. And research, government laboratories are essential to the state because they need regulatory knowledge. They need to make regulation. If you take in environment, they need at Environment Canada, for example, they need to develop models, computer models of the atmosphere to understand spillover of oil. It's good for the society. But it's not a peer review. It's when you're doing kind of your research and you want to compete with the other one. The Perimeter Institute is a private organization by someone who had millions of dollars and decided he liked quantum physics. That's fine. But if he does not have the money, he should close it instead of asking the minister to put 50 million in it. And the scientists there should compete with Hunru at UBC, who is a great researcher, who go to NSERC. and does not have the stamp of this institution. So there is a manipulation of what is peer review and what is free research. Government laboratories has nothing to do with this. They are there to answer to specific regulatory. Is this pill dangerous? What are the consequences for health research of doing this kind of pills or announcing on TV? They have not just announced a new treatment. Government needs science to make policy. It's policy. It's science for policy. And here we were more talking about policy for science. But there are science for policy. But the analogy of the perimeter with the government labs does not fly.
As a citizen, we sometimes feel outside that process and not at all involved. And one of the, I'm not sure if this is on, as part of a pressure group, we tried to influence the Republic of Science that you have there, spoke to people in the granting agencies to allow some entry or some consultation and to move forward from peer review into something more open. Can you talk about or indicate any place that you've seen true democratization in a field of endeavor in science?
Oh, yes, that's a difficult one because, of course, it depends on what you mean by democratization of science. You know, I like a very fundamental, I think, insight that Alexis de Tocqueville, who wrote, you know, Democracy in America, I have the French title, De la démocratie en Amérique. He has a whole chapter on science. And what is great in this book, he says, you know, science is aristocratic. He said, if science becomes democratic, like in the States, there will no be more pure science because the demos will want practical thing. They will want health. They will want environment research because but they won't want pure research. That's what he writes, okay? In fact, he is wrong on the consequences. We could explain that. But his insight was right. He's wrong because he forgot that there would be in the 40s and 50s and 60s, pressure group of science. What is the American Association for the Advancement of Science? It's a spokesperson of science saying that we must invest in pure science. So the reason there are pure science, that there are pressure groups, the Canadian Association of Physicists, the Canadian Association of Chemists, name it, around the world, they defend pure science. So what is a science which is democratic? I think it needs much more scrutinized as its meaning, because if you have a sample of population, which means a real sample of population, you would have people with high school, another one with a MD degree, another one with a technical training, and do they decide that we should look at quantum mechanics? I'm not sure they will say yes because the consequences. So I think he was not wrong in saying that science is aristocratic. So talking about democratic science, it's a slippery slope. But the reality is that they have impact in the group. We have shown it, and the government takes that into account. Take only SSHRC or NSERC. Half of the board are now people who are not scientists, who are people coming from bank, from industry. Of course, you could question if they are citizens, okay? But some will say, yes, our persons, they are citizens. So I just want to push the idea that every time we use a word which seems very nice, oh, we must be democratic. It's like when we say we must be transparent. Why? We could show in sociology that some consequences of so-called transparency are worse than what is supposed to be the consequences. Not everything can be transparent, because if it would be true, no politicians would lie. They will tell you all the danger coming out in the streets, all the danger on the train. They won't tell you that, because transparency has limits. So I'm worried about the easy generalization of let's be democratic. Let's be democratic in science. I don't know what it means, I think. It can be dangerous, except if it's at the broader level. Should we invest in research that will have consequences? People will say yes. So the problem with asking them is that, as any sociologist would know, it will all hinges on the way the question is framed in the poll. If you ask people, the question will be raised in such a way you know the answer will be yes or no. So I describe that we see those pressure groups. I don't know where it will come, where it will go, but I think that there's a lot of resistance. So up to now, for example, it does not affect much of the research activities. Not much, okay? Except through the priorities. For example, in the 90s, the government says, we need new research on the new economy. They put 40 millions. Then SSHRC says, okay, we'll decide who are the best doing new economy. In the 70s, and SSHRC says, we need research on new solar energy. Then NSERC says, here are the best researchers. This, I think, if I have to give my own view as an intellectual, my own view is that this is very bad, this is even dangerous, this works well, and it takes that into account. I'm not for scrapping those interactions. I'm just for scrapping this one, which is the most dangerous. Those one can be taken into account in diverse ways. It has been shown through the analysis of consensus conferences. They say it's a sampling. It's not a sampling. They sample people who are trained enough to accept most of the paradigm in science. Okay, they don't take cranky people in those places. They know it will be discussed. So it's not an answer, but it's a comment around it.
Can I have a follow-up? You described a system that is basically top-down, where the payee, the people with the money, direct science, and the peers direct their own scientific research. But you haven't indicated any place where society at large can make influence on that system besides through their elected members.
You're right, because I think that influence, it's too, I would say, it's too, elle est très floue. It's a diffuse. Here, it's not a diffuse influence, a direct influence that can be shown. But the kind of influence you're talking about is a diffuse one. For example, why do we put a lot of money on cancer research and less on flu or I don't know what? I'm not expert in biology. But if we look at the correlations between the prevalence of illness and the investment of R&D, it's not correlated, which common sense would say that it should be most prevalent, should be the most research. It's not the most prevalent with the most research. So it's linked to influences. So you're right, I don't know detailed cases where there is a real obvious input through that. The only one I see is through this one. Because then those go government and government says, I decide. Those has been documented.
I want to pursue this a little bit further and maybe in a different direction. One of the buzzwords that's being bandied about in the political world recently is the idea of evidence-based policy. And given the proliferation of both groups interested in engaging in that policy discussion and also the varied sources of quote-unquote evidence, how should policymakers parse through that and determine what actually constitutes evidence that is worthy of policy? And what kind of advice would you provide on that front?
You know, that's a fundamentally profound question, and there's no short answer because the paradox there is that, of course, again, who is against evidence? Nobody, okay? So when we started to talk about evidence-based medicine, the first thing that I think struck me is that, do you mean that up to now, it was not based on evidence? So that's a bit bizarre. So there is, when we ask the negative question, it says, okay, it means that evidence-based medicine means more than evidence because it was based on evidence, okay? But it was based on some evidence, but now the kind of evidence is that they don't mean, in some cases, evidence-based medicine. They mean double-blind, standard, blah, blah, blah. They mean a particular protocol. Okay, and those protocol has been shown by, again, historians and sociologists of science, that they can be manipulated. So I think there is no outside this kind of box, because in the policy arena, what kind of evidence? You can take the Cato Institute. Do you take the evidence of the Conference Board of Canada? Do you take the evidence of the Fraser Institute? Or you take evidence from Yves Gingras? So there's no solution to that. The only solution we can help to push is to say, I want some institutions that have all the appearance of being the most disinterested. And there was an institution like that for a long time that we are now trying to destroy. It's called the university. Okay? As a university academic, the reason why I'm an intellectual is that I'm tenured. Nobody can tell me what to say and what not to say. Okay? But if you're in a think tank, you know, from the start, I read the think tank in Montreal called the Montreal Economics Institute, Institut Économique de Montréal. They are it's surprising that those guys are trained in economics, okay? Because when they have the report, it doesn't fly. But it's presented as evidence. So as everything, it's a struggle. So you have not only a struggle between interest group, you have a struggle to define what is the legitimate definition of evidence. And it's an open thing. There's no solution except, but if I have to make a choice, I want to make sure that there are still in universities people like me, people like you, who are not in contract with a company and can give their best analysis that can be then discussed by others. But there will be no straightforward solution. There are always interests around. I showed it enough that we don't know where to trust now. Every time we see something, we have to scratch the back to be sure there's not a big company behind it or a Cato Institute to pay for it. And directly, it's very complicated, so there's no answer to, I cannot answer this question.
So Yves, I feel that there's something missing from this diagram, and that's commercialization. That when we think about government priorities in science, they're not just government priorities to solve social problems or citizen problems, health problems. They also are to add to the GDP. And so there's a lot of pressure now when it goes through that circle that what comes out at the other end is a company or a patent or whatever.
Yeah. You will find out, not a nice answer, but I would say it's there. It's under pressure groups. I didn't name them all, of course, because, of course, every time there is a budget, it's called pre-budgetary discussions. Every big shots, every Bank of Canada go there, Bank of Sweden, all the bankers, all the industry representatives are pressure groups. They say, oh, you should cut the taxes because the company will fly away. So it's taken in, and they will say, put more industrial research in the system, put less, and the university presidents are a pressure group. They go to see the ministers, our best intellectuals will fly away to the United States if you don't put more research or R&D. The indirect cost of research should be taken into account. So you're right, but it's in this, so they play a strong role in the end there. But the good point is that in the end, they could decide to give nothing there. But they still give things to quantum mechanics, to the age of the universe. So it means that it's a very complicated thing. Even Harper had not got all of biology up to now.
But just, Yves, but just to follow up on Leslie's question, I mean, is this the new social contract for government science, or is this the new social contract for science? Because if it's the new social contract for science, then pressure groups doesn't quite capture the kinds of issues that I think we can expand from Leslie's comment about, right? Because in fact, there's all this other science that's not going through any of these channels whatsoever. It's the corporate science, it's startup science, it's there's all this many other forms of science, which I think actually should be put into the social contract, because there are lots of people who feel that is part of the whole enterprise of science in a systemic way and not just incidental off on the side.
Yeah. I totally agree. So you're right that this is, when I did that, I said, okay, I want to understand science, society, government, but it's true that anyone, or take any big shots who have billions and create a company to create life. Craig Venters wants to create life. Okay, suppose it's not there because it's not of that. The reason it's not there is that we can say, but I'm not like that, but I won't say it. We can say, oh, it should be there. I said, no, I'm not an activist, okay? I'm just saying that for the citizen who says, where is my money coming on? I said, there has been a big change. When Vannevar Bush does his report, he's not looking at private science of General Electric. General Electric is doing a big lab or closes his lab at Bell Labs. Okay, it closes it. That's it. But I mean, it's not in this system. You're right, it's not there because I have not talked about this part because we have first much less access to it. And if we took just the economic part of it, we know it well. Okay, because we have done something on this in Quebec. We had, biochem pharma. We had a big rise into corporate biotechnology firms. They have been all bought, but this is typical accumulation and concentration of capital. They have been bought by big pharma, which has become more and more. But this is totally outside of this. But it's not outside the sociology of science. There's a lot of work on this, in your work too, but there are a lot of works. But here you're right, if I social contract, I should be more explicit. I said about these relationships, because I thought that our discussion will be more on that. So the really private science, where someone now can go in his own basement, it's called garage science. We don't have access to that. Pressure group about morals and ethics will create that. We should include that, but in the capitalist system, you cannot stop General Electric to close or create his new lab. I'm not saying it's good or not. I'm predicting that you cannot do that. So you're right that it's not all of science. There's a lot of science which is not there, but this one is the one on which we have impact. And we have very clear impact, and I use Canadian cases to show that we have impact. It's the government who decided to give money for the Zamboni treatment. It's the government, for right or wrong, but we have to understand it. But you're right, there's another place for this, I will call it private science, that I did not touch at all, but we agree on this.
You've several times mentioned the Fraser Institute and other economic researchers. Yeah. Do you consider economics as science in this context of your work? And also, do you see any movement towards peer review in the economic world?
Okay. There are peer review in the economic world in the subset of economic field. Economic departments write papers in the Journal of Economic Literature, Kenyan Journal of Economics, so there are peer review there. And then there are all those think tanks that write their papers which are a kind of imitating science. They have notes in the page, they will cite data, they will put statistics. Of course, they manipulate them, but they will put them. So, but that's what they do. So, of course, I don't think economics is a science. I did a lot of things on it. I will just a small example to explain now. What I like with economics is that, sociologically speaking, what they did as a discipline is very simple. They say, okay, we want to be a science. They looked at physics. They said, okay, physics has become a science, has become mathematized. And how did they do that? It's easy. Starting with Galileo, they said, okay, if we want to understand a phenomena, first we create a vacuum. It's called the vacuum pump. In a vacuum pump, everything falls at the same acceleration. It's shown in all science centers. You show a small thing and a big thing, and they go together. So they did the same. They said, okay, I want to be a science. I need mathematics and vacuum. So they created a world in which there's no citizens, no power politics, no limited rationality, no ignorance, and they maximize a function. It's called the maximization of the free hand of the market. And then they try to predict the world. It does not work. And philosophers of economics have shown something which is very interesting, is that economics is a self-fulfilling prophecy, which is true. For example, the university system, the field of universities was not a market, has never been a market. Now neo-economics liberal says, hey, this should be a market. Of course, if you say it should be a market, it will become a market. I can transform my family in a market. My family is a give and take system. It's a pre-capitalist system. I say to my son, can you go at the corner of the street to buy apple juice? Because I don't have the time now. He goes and come back. I can transform that into a capitalist system. He will come and say, okay, it took me 10 minutes. You owe me $1. Then I would say, okay, then you owe me $2 because I'm paying your high school. And at the end of the month, we'll make a budget. I will have transformed the family into the capitalist system. So there is very few sciences who are self-fulfilling, but philosophers of science have shown that economics is a self-fulfilling prophecy. So it can become a reality, but it's not a science. But they believe they are a science. And the reason they do that is by performance. For example, they have created the Bank of Sweden Prize in Economic Sciences in honor of Alfred Nobel. Now ask yourself, why has the Bank of Sweden created a prize with 10 words in it? A Bank of Sweden Prize in Economic Sciences in honor of Alfred Nobel. Why? Any discipline who create a prize, name it after their father. So they should have called it the Adam Smith Prize. So you tell me, why they have not called it the Adam Smith Prize? Because they wanted to use the symbolic capital of the word Nobel Prize. So they call, in honor of Alfred Nobel. The journalist, I like them, wants to be short. So they said the Nobel Prize of Economics. But there's no such a thing as a Nobel Prize of Economics. That does not exist. It's the Bank of Sweden Prize. But now the journalists have presented that as a Nobel Prize. So it's again a proof that even in in their social presence, economists perform the world. Now people believe they have a Nobel Prize economics, and then they ask them, oh, what do you think about the latest bubble? You know, the latest one this week, it's funny you mention economics, it's by Eugene Fama. Fama is famous for having said everywhere that there is no such a thing as a bubble. There cannot be economic crisis, you know, because the market is perfect. The price of the thing is the only signal, so it's impossible, okay? And he got the prize where his own theory has been falsified, to use simple Popperian criteria, as being false since 30 years, but they give him the prize. So it's pure manipulation.
We will have to give Yves a break at some point, so let's make this the second last question, please.
Merci, c'est très intéressant. Coming back to your social contract question or table, my question is, how much of this is about science, or how much is it about the change in the social contract in a large way? You could probably replace the word science for culture here, and for culture,
Okay.
and would that work? And what would be the impact of technology, like now with the amount of information that moves into different pressure groups, and then the world is more organized and the elected officials are more pressured into things. So we have a different environment altogether. So as a sociologist, you must have reflected on what are the root causes of this?
Oh, I wanted to suggest the many causal interconnection, because in fact it's a multi-causal system. For example, you have the development of technologies, they develop, but it means that with those technologies you have those things. Now, 20 years ago, someone who had the syndrome fatigue was really anxious because they are really considered as crazy and lazy. Now he found that there's a website and there are thousands like, oh, I'm not alone, you have this problem. So the technology helps this group to crystallize into a form, and then it's okay, let's send a petition to the minister. So it's multi-causal. There's no simple explanation to everything. And of course, those things can have effects on culture. I'm not an expert on culture. I just wanted to show that in science, there has been changes. Of course, everyone feels them, so I tried to kind of synthesize them to help us understand the consequences of those arrows. Of course, arrows, like everything, are always a way to simplify and presenting, but I think they give us directions of analysis, and it always shows also what is not there. For example, in showing that, we say, okay, then I realized that a lot of private science is not there. So it's a useful thinking of even the things we're not looking at. So you're right, I just look at science and technology here, not culture or things, arts, for example.
Okay. As presented, peer review is a critical element of the Republic of Science.
Yeah.
I mean, a recent issue of Science had a scientist sending out a nonsensical paper to be peer reviewed by journals, and surprisingly, a large number of them, agreed to publish it. So if the concept of peer review is called into doubt, how does that affect the legitimacy of science? Because, for example, for the social sciences, SoCal has sent out a paper, and that created a lot of controversy because, you could get a nonsensical paper published, and the scientists were too happy with that.
Yes, I know. You're referring to this issue of science, which is a very good issue about science, the transformation of science communication due to the new technology. And they did this experiment. But in fact, nobody has ever said that with peer review, you will get only truth. The tenet is that you will at least have tested it through a few other experts. What is fascinating, if you want me a comment on this paper, it's very interesting. If I would write a letter to Science, is to see, Science is famous as a journal who is seen as scientific, accepts only paper which methodology is very good. This paper there is totally flawed methodologically from a social science point of view, because it took one sample of open journal and sent them a faked paper. What he should have done, and it would have been, because it's still good as a proof, but it's totally flawed, because he should have taken another group of toll journal where you pay and send the same paper. And I would tell you what I think he would have found. He would have still found quite a lot of journals told who have accepted it, but he would have found at least twice, as he did in the free, in the open access journal, because we know since at least a year that there is a lot of new predatory journal in the open access, because in the open access we are in the transitory place where I say, wow, we'll create a new journal, scientists want to publish, we'll ask them a few $100 and we'll publish everything. So the flaw in it is not that open accept everything and toll have a good peer review system. That's flawed. The proof is that at least at the beginning they say that PLOS had rejected the paper. And PLOS is an open access but non-profit journal, which is a kind of incarnation of the scientific community with peer review, and they rejected the paper. So it's a flawed paper, but you're right that peer review is not perfect. But there's nothing perfect in the world. The point is that, do we prefer this? Between this and this, it's always a comparison we have to make. We should never think, oh, what is democracy? No. Is it that or that you want? My choice is that. I choose that, though it's not perfect. Because as we know, our friends are our colleagues, but our colleagues are also our competitors. And those are the ones who will say that my latest SSHRC grant is not good, and it's a scandal that this guy is a Canada chair, and he will not get a SSHRC grant. That's the game of peer review, and we have to accept its limits.
Thank you.